They knew. They sent the warnings. They begged the people in power to listen, and nobody listened. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the catastrophe destroying your world, the one that swallowed homes, ripped families apart, and buried entire communities under rubble and grief, could have been stopped, not prevented by luck, not dodged by miracle, stopped deliberately by the very people whose only job was to protect you. This is not fiction. This is not a conspiracy theory buried in the dark corners of the internet. This is documented history, cold, terrifying, and unforgivable. Scientists had the data. Engineers had the evidence. Specialists filed reports, sent letters, and stood in rooms filled with powerful men and women, and told them exactly what was coming. They described the disaster in chilling detail. The scale, the timeline, the body count. They used words like imminent, like catastrophic, like irreversible. The response? Silence, dismissal, and in some cases, active suppression. The warnings were buried. The experts were sidelined. And when the disaster finally arrived, as it always does when you ignore the people who see it, and coming, the death toll, the destruction, the unimaginable suffering was blamed on everything except the truth. We are going to pull back the curtain on one of history's most damning examples of willful negligence. A disaster that didn't have to happen. A catastrophe that was seen, predicted, and deliberately ignored by those in power. So ask yourself this: who do you hold responsible when the people meant to protect you choose silence over truth? To understand the full weight of this betrayal, you need to understand the world in which it unfolded. The setting was one built on trust. Communities thriving under the assumption that the systems designed to safeguard them were functioning, that the leaders elected or appointed to serve them were watching, that the experts hired to monitor the fragile line between safety and catastrophe were being heard. They were wrong. Behind closed doors, a very different story was playing out. A network of people, scientists, engineers, environmental specialists, had been monitoring something deeply alarming for months, in some cases years. The data they were collecting pointed in one direction, toward collapse, toward devastation, toward the kind of event that, once it began, could not be undone. These were not alarmists. These were not people seeking attention or trying to sabotage the systems they worked within. These were professionals who had dedicated their lives to understanding the very mechanisms that were now failing, and they were terrified. Reports were filed, models were run, projections were shared, and then quietly shelved. The language used in internal memos became increasingly desperate. Words like urgent, critical, immediate action required, appearing again and again in documents that would later be dragged into the light of public scrutiny. But here is where the story turns truly dark, because this was not simply a case of warnings falling through the cracks of bureaucracy. Evidence would later reveal, buried deep within restricted files and sealed testimonies, that certain decision-makers had been briefed personally. Not once, multiple times. They chose to do nothing, and the reason why was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Power protects power. This is not a modern revelation. It is an ancient rule that has governed human civilization since the first person was placed in post, authority over another. But rarely has that rule produced consequences as devastating or as clearly documented as in the disaster we are exploring today. The experts who raised alarms were not wrong. Every data point they presented, every projection they modeled, every warning they issued would eventually be confirmed in the most brutal way possible by the disaster itself. When investigators later compared the original warnings to the actual event, the alignment was terrifying. The experts had described it almost exactly. The scale, the location, the mechanism of failure, the projected death toll, all of it accurate. All of it ignored. But here is the jaw-dropping moment that redefines everything you think you know about this disaster. Internal documents, some classified, some simply buried under the weight of institutional indifference, revealed that acting on the warnings would have cost a fraction of what the disaster ultimately consumed. The financial cost of prevention was calculated, the political cost of action was assessed, and those in power decided that the expense, economic, political, reputational, was simply not worth it. They gambled with lives, with communities, with futures, and they lost. Catastrophically, when the disaster finally struck, it moved with the speed and force of something that had been held back too long. There was no gradual warning for the people caught in its path, no orderly evacuation, no last-minute intervention from the authorities who could have prevented it all. Instead, there was chaos, there was loss, there was the kind of collective suffering that scars not just individuals, but entire generations. Survivors would later describe the same thing, over and over, in testimonies that are almost unbearable to read. They described the moment they realized that what was happening to them had not needed to happen, that somewhere, in some office, someone had known and had said nothing. One expert, who had spent years fighting to be heard, later described the experience with words that remain etched in the historical record. They were treated as alarmists, dismissed as obsessives, accused of exaggeration, right up until the moment the world proved them right. By then, it was far, far too late. In the aftermath, the world demanded answers. The scale of the devastation was impossible to contain. The human cost, measured not just in lives lost, but in psychological wounds, displaced families, shattered livelihoods, was impossible to ignore. Investigations were opened. Committees were formed. Whistleblowers, some of the very experts who had been silenced, stepped forward with written documentation that made the deliberate suppression of warnings undeniable. Files that had been classified, memos that had been altered, meetings that had no official record but left a trail of digital and physical evidence, impossible to erase. The reckoning was slow and deeply incomplete. Some of those responsible were pushed into early retirement. Others faced public inquiries where they offered carefully worded non-answers under oath. A handful were held legally accountable, their penalties so inadequate against the scale of the harm they had enabled that many survivors described the legal process as a second betrayal. Others escaped entirely, protected by institutional loyalty, by expensive legal teams, by the sheer complexity of assigning individual blame within broken systems designed to diffuse responsibility. They vanished back into the fabric of professional life, largely unscathed. And the survivors? They rebuilt, or tried to. Many never fully recovered. Economically, physically, psychologically. The scars of a preventable disaster are different from those left by random fate, because they carry with them not just grief, but anger, the knowledge that it did not have to be this way. Why does this matter today? Because the pattern, expert warnings issued, authorities briefed, action blocked by the calculus of money and power, has not vanished from the world. We see it in environmental crises, where scientists are dismissed. We see it in infrastructure failures, where budget took precedence over safety. We see it in public health emergencies, where the uncomfortable truth was buried until the comfortable lie was no longer viable. This disaster is not just history. It is a mirror. Every disaster has two stories, the one told by those in power and the one buried beneath it. The experts who saw this coming were not extraordinary people. They were doing their jobs, meticulously, honestly, with the kind of professional courage that asks nothing of the world except to be heard. What defeated them was not a lack of evidence. It was something far older and far more stubborn than data. It was the willingness of those who held power to protect their position above everything else, above communities, above lives, above the undeniable truth sitting in front of them. History records this, but history alone changes nothing. What changes things is us. The people who refuse to let these buried truths stay buried. The people who ask uncomfortable questions, who demand that the warnings of today are treated with the weight they deserve, who understand that silence, even comfortable, convenient silence, is never neutral. We carry the memory of those who suffered not as a burden, but as a responsibility. If this dark history moved you, if it made you angry, or sorrowful, or simply more awake to the world, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, subscribe and stay with us, because there are many more truths waiting to be exposed.